Let's get going. I'm Leslie Wade. I'm conference chair for this year's NAFEX conference, joined by Chris Heater, our president, and Chris O'Mannix, our facilitator, and of course, our guest speaker, Steven Edholm. So Chris, you want to take it away?
Yeah. So anyway, welcome to our keynote speech by Steven Edholm. And this is the North American Fruit Explorers 2022 virtual conference. And our motto is good fruit ground up. So thank you today for joining us. My name is Chris O'Mannix, and I'm a volunteer board member of NAFEX, as we call it for short. And I'll be serving as the facilitator of this session entitled Grassroots Apple Breeding, How Small-Scale Growers Are Rebuilding Apple Diversity. Before I introduce this panel, speaker, there's a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. So first, unlike normal Zoom meetings, it's actually in the webinar format, which means that audio and video features are automatically disabled. So down below, you'll see a Q&A button, and we encourage people to ask questions, whether they're topical questions or support questions. We're here to help, and we're here to answer them. So third, if you're new to Zoom, you can adjust your screen view and actually a lot of settings on your device. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be made to members in 1 to 2 days at our website, nafex.org. So a few words about NAFEX itself. We were founded in 1967 as North American Fruit Explorers, and we are a network of individuals throughout the United States and Canada devoted to the discovery, cultivation, and appreciation of superior varieties of fruits and nuts. Although our membership ranks include professional pomologists, nursery owners, and commercial orchardists alike, we're also all amateurs at heart in the truest sense of the word, and we're motivated by our fine love of fruit. NAFEX members share ideas, information, experiences, and fruit propagation material via our website, social media, primarily Facebook, fruit-specific interest group meetings, and annual conferences like this one, whether in person or online or both. As a paid NAFEX member, you get 4 editions of the Pomona Journal each year, as well as the ability to search back through 50 years of Pomonas in our digital library. And I encourage you to do that. There is a lot of information there. This organization exists because of members like you. This is your organization. So we all encourage you as board members to get involved, to maintain active status. And there's various ways you can get involved. You can be involved in our interest groups. There are a number of membership chair positions that need to be filled. Then there's just if you have skills, various skills, this is a great organization to get involved with. And we're really trying to grow our membership ranks again to what we had a couple decades ago. So please visit our website to learn more at nafex.org. So anyway, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Steven Edholm today. And a polymathic writer, teacher, experimenter, and content creator. His long-standing interests are in primitive technology, natural history, self-reliance, traditional skills, tools, materials, and horticulture. The primary mission of his project is to disseminate practical, inspiring content that encourages people to engage with life and their environments, and helps them move towards being more self-contained, knowledgeable, and free-thinking. For the last 15 years, projects and experiments have been carried out on a 40-acre homestead in Northern California. Future dreams include a newer, bigger, better homestead laboratory for various altruistically oriented projects housed under a nonprofit status. Some current and future projects include continuing apple and other plant breeding endeavors, innovative grafting experiments, improving and reforming tree training practices, research and development of inventions related to horticulture, biochar and soil improvement, and working towards a broadly integrated sustainable leather tanning model. So again, you can find them at skillcult.com. And with that said, I would like to hand the floor off to Steven so he can give his talk. So good luck, Steven.
Thank you. I don't need luck. Okay, so I just want to thank you guys for having me and welcome to the talk. I haven't been involved with NAFEX or really any organizations, but I very much recognize the importance of NAFEX to people like me and me specifically with this lineage, that comes down. This organization was started the year I was born, and I'm 55, 1967. So there's something to think about right there. This talk is going to be not so much about the nuts and bolts of apple breeding. I don't think that's the most important thing to cover right now, but we could potentially do that in other talks in the future. I have my notes up here, so I'm going to have to keep looking up. Might be a little odd, but that's the best way I could figure out how to do this. We're going to have to kind of like hammer this out because I have a lot to cover. There's more than I could actually cover here. So if, I did everything I wanted to, but we could, again, cover some more of that in other talks. So let me share my screen here. Okay, so I've been at this for about 12 years, and I counted my seedlings recently, and I had around 265 seedlings that are grafted out, waiting to fruit. I probably out of those are probably fruited. Again, I'm guessing because I'm a terrible record keeper, but maybe 75 to 100 seedling apples have fruited. So quite a few. I have some numbers there. There were people doing this before me. People that come to mind are Derek Mills, Freddie Mensch, who largely inspired me to do it, Nigel Deacon in England. The thing about my project is that I just went public with it. So at some point I was like, hey, how cool would it be if I started making YouTube videos on breeding apples and people could follow this process along for literally years and watch how these things develop, watch what my successes were like, because at the time I had no seedlings had fruited at all. But I just had this really strong sense that it was going to work. And, as soon as I started doing those videos, I was already pitching the idea that the myth that you can't grow apples from seed was wrong, and inviting other people to join in the fun. So, yeah, my project has had large ripple effects. I hear from people all the time that are like, wow, I saw your content. I'm starting a little apple breeding project. Some of these people have never grown anything in their lives, and they're just planting some seedling apples in their backyard, which is so cool and gratifying to see that. And I think this cat's out of the bag and that it's going to continue to grow and become popular because it is just super fun. So you guys all know that there's a common misconception that you can't grow apples from seed, or that it's going to be like 1 in thousands of these apples is going to be any good, right? So this myth existed for a long time, but I think what really cemented it in the public mind was Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire. So one whole section of that book is on apples. And the entire chapter is basically, his whole theory is built on this construct that if you plant an apple from seed, you're almost certainly going to get something terrible, like completely inedible, not just mediocre or bad or, whatever, just really, really bad. Ironically, I think that Michael Pollan actually, let's see, I think he was partly responsible for the current apple renaissance. Because a lot of people read that book, it was very popular, and got just excited that there was more to apples than the few apples that were in the grocery store, because frankly, there were not very many. There's a lot more now than when in the grocery store than when I started this project, a lot more. It's really diversified a lot. But there's no doubt that, he did a great disservice to breeding and selection. And that's unfortunate. We can't, just consign that to the scrap heap of history. It's already been published. It couldn't be rewritten because the entire thing is completely built around that idea. So it just have to be a completely different approach to apples, basically. So I had read that before I moved to this 40-acre homestead, and I've been grafting trees and, interested in fruit and stuff for a long time, but I never had my own place. So, I do a little bit here and a little bit there. When I got here, it was like, okay, yeah, it's like, finally, it's time to sink some real roots. I started researching apples and just got really into apples, especially talking to my friend Freddie Mensch, who some of you know probably. And I just wasn't buying the whole thing. You can't grow an apple from seed. And the first seeds I planted, I had gotten a box of Wixon apples from my friends at the apple farm in Philo, California, and for helping them build a root cellar. And I was eating my way through these apples, and I thought, these apples are so good. It just doesn't make sense that I, couldn't take a handful of these seeds and plant them and get something at least like pretty good, like 1 or 2 apples that are pretty good. So being not one to follow the herd, I went ahead and planted some seeds. I don't know, maybe like 7 or 8 seeds. I just planted them straight in the ground. I ended up grafting 4 or 5 of those out to trees that I already had growing at the time, because I'd been here for a little while by then and had some trees going. And I just waited for them to fruit. So the very first apple that fruited for me ever, it was one of those open pollinated Wixon seedlings, and it is now known as Bite Me. That's all capital letters with an exclamation point for all the people who say that you can't grow apples from seed. That apple fits none of the standard stereotype characteristics of a seedling apple, which would be kind of a hard, sour, green, low sugar, inedible thing. If anything, its fault is that it's too polite. The skin is super thin and easy to eat. The flesh is easy to eat. The flavors are mild. It just flies in the face of all that. So, right away, that became my poster child for growing apples from seed. Now, I fruited 3 more apples from that batch of seeds. That's Bite Me there. One is this one, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with this apple. It's a small, pretty apple. It just does not distinguish itself in any way at all. So it's just boring. There's no reason for me to propagate it or keep it. So far, it hasn't distinguished itself at all. This is another one. This one's called jujube because it actually tastes like a jujube, and like a jujube fruit, if you've ever had one, it's just kind of cloyingly sweet. There's very low acid. The reason I'm interested in this apple is that it has the savory flavor of Wixon, which so does Bite Me, and it ripens in August. So, for further breeding, this interests me because, I want to carry that savory flavor forward, which we'll talk about presently in more apples. And if I could get into early apples, that would be just great. And the last one was just a tiny green crab. It wasn't sour or bitter or anything. It was just super bland and boring and useless. So that one got hacked. Anyway, them odds aren't too bad, right? 4 seeds, 3 very edible apples, and 1 that's, kind of become a homestead favorite. Bite Me is, people respond really well to it when I feed it to them here. Like often they'll say, oh, that was my favorite one even. It's a peculiar apple in that the texture is very soft and tender, but it has that rich savory flavor from Wixon, and that's amazing. So right after that, by the next spring, I was already hooked, and I was like, I couldn't resist the allure of taking all these different apples that there are and starting to pick parents and stick them together, because that's where it gets really fun, right? And so by the next spring, I was already making cross-pollinations. Out of that spring's cross-pollinations, I planted around 70-something trees, I think, and that was my first batch of trees that was pollinated in 2011. In that batch, all the one parent was always grenadine. So it was grenadine with Wixon, Gold Rush, Golden Russet, Lady Williams mostly, and then a few others like Cherry Cox and King David, which turned out to be worthwhile crosses to make. And, again, like going into this, no one got it. Like I would talk to people about it because I'm like a super nerd that way. Whatever I'm interested in, it's just like, talking all the time to everybody. And people would just be like, oh, they had no idea there was really anything but yellow, red, and green apples from the store. Or maybe like at the time, Fuji and Gala, they would mention Fuji and Gala. But even growers and fruit people kind of just viewed the whole idea askance a little bit. It seemed like I remember my mom saying something along the lines of like, I think you're taking this apple thing a little too far, And I was just like, wow, these people don't get it. Like, I don't see how they don't see this amazing potential here, because that's what I saw. And I always fall in love with potential. And I just thought, wow, there's so many different kinds of apples, and a lot of them have not been developed and could use improvement. So, excuse me here. Okay, so I just, of course, forged forward with it anyway. So I got about those 70 in the ground, and then each year, not every year, but many years after that, I would do cross pollinations and put them in the ground. At the time, I had no business starting such a project. I had gotten Lyme disease years before. Most of the time I've been here, I've functioned on a much, much lower energy budget than most people do. You wouldn't think that watching my content, but yeah, I run on fumes a lot of the time, and a lot of the time I've spent here on this homestead doing all these projects has just been a total grind. What I do though is I do interesting things that I think have a high potential, and the rest of my life just kind of is chaos on the side, and I'm living like a barn animal or something, right? So it's a good thing, because here we are now, right? Good thing I'm like that. So around that time, I was starting to study Albert Eder. In the last first half of the last century, he was breeding apples. His mentor also told him not to bother, if I recall right from what he said. But I remember reading about him and just saying that, look, I was able to improve apples in the first generation. And I thought, well, there you go. See, that I'm right. And there was also this study that was done, and this was at the Geneva Experimental Station in New York, Agriculture Experiment Station. And they made all these crosses. You can see them on the screen there, some of the different crosses they made. They fruited 106 apple trees. And at the time, they had claimed that this was kind of a new thing. Like they were the first to basically do intentional breeding with apples, which wasn't really true. I mean, there was like gentleman farmers in Europe doing it and stuff like that. But anyway, they were probably the first to really go, let's do this for real and make a major undertaking. So out of those 106 apples that they fruited, 13 were actually named and released, and then 14 were kept for further observation. So they were interesting enough to hang on to and say, like, well, maybe we'd end up naming these too. So that's about a quarter of the apples between those two numbers. And again, then ain't too bad of odds right there. And so that just gave me more, incentive to keep going. So when I first put videos out, I was already pitching the idea that this myth that you couldn't grow apples from seed was incorrect. And I was already inviting people to, join in the fun and do this. And that was way more successful than I had thought it could be. Okay, so a really important aspect of this project for me has always been this altruistic, collaborative mindset, kind of an open source mindset. Because, if we treat breeding as a group effort, first of all, no one person has to grow hundreds of seedlings. We can just all be growing small amounts of seedlings. And if we're collaborating and sharing, then we are in a group pool. And also we could do it way faster, right? Because, I can take my crosses now, like as soon as I get something that seems good out of a seedling, I'm sending pollen out, as much as I can to people so they don't have to start over. If we're all working in isolation, then we're, just kind of starting over and having to do the foundation work all over again. And breeding is basically about building on the foundations that people have left before. We get to inherit this stuff that Albert Eder did, and that's a lot of what I work with. But also of the modern breeders and whatever, you use good parents, that's what you do. So that's really important to me, to always try to set an example toward that kind of community and that kind of a culture with this project, rather than kind of a closed working in isolation thing for more personal reasons. And so for some people, like especially if they're working on a large scale, they need some kind of personal motive or profit motive, and that's fine. It takes all kinds. But what I'm trying to foster really is just this kind of open source mentality, and really just getting back to the altruistic part of it, where we're breeding for improvement. We're breeding for the fruit. We're improving the fruit for humanity, and we're improving the culture and building a viable, vital food culture. So this ostensibly, you might, from the outside, you think, well, this is about improving fruit. But there's a real undercurrent for me always that I also try to communicate, that it's about taking back responsibility in a fun way. Maybe, people might be triggered by that word, but definitely in a fun way, for breeding and selection. So you might think of our involvement with our food as a hierarchy. So at one extreme, someone's going to put a plate in front of you, you're going to stuff the food in your face, and they're going to take the plate away, and that's, done. And then maybe you go off to college and you have to go to the corner store and microwave a burrito all by yourself. And then next, you might cook some food at home. Maybe it's mac and cheese, but then you're buying ingredients and cooking. And then you're like, hey, let's go to the farmer's market and meet some producers and get some interesting, vegetable varieties, and we'll cook those. Then you might be, hey, I'll grow some tomato plants, and then I'll grow a bigger garden. And then let's get some heirlooms and preserve the heirlooms and try out new stuff. And then finally, you're like, well, let's save seed, right? So you save seed and you've created a loop, right? You plant the seed, you save the seed, you plant the seed, and you got the kind of this closed thing going. What's missing from that picture is breeding and selection. And breeding and selection is every bit as much a part of our agricultural, horticultural heritage as any of the rest of that, or the heirloom seeds themselves. If nobody did that in the first place, they wouldn't exist. There's also maybe an idea out there that the pinnacle has already been reached. If someone could do it, it would already be done. No way. Like, almost every plant has huge potential for improvement. And that's what we should be doing, is we should be continuing to improve those things. So I was going to do a talk for the California raw fruit growers right before COVID, and I was going to call it apples, the gateway fruit. And that was in reference to this idea that we should be involved in breeding and selection, and that, apples are super interesting. So they just have all this diversity and all these different flavors, and they're exciting and fun, and there's so many of them that people just get really excited about it and very involved easily. But, the idea being that it's kind of this gateway into this idea of getting a foot in the door of saying, yeah, well, we can and should be improving plant varieties for humanity. I mean, it's our job and no one else's. So I've done a lot of research on, there's hours and hours and hours and hours of research on heirloom apples, going through Google books, searching for varieties and reading about different stuff. And you run into these, this is like in very old books and periodicals and notes of meetings of fruit organizations and stuff like that. And you see these conversations showing up in the 1800s where a orchardist might be like, oh yeah, well, these hands down are my favorite apples. These are the best apples, but actually I grow this apple because I can get it to market, put it on a train, get it to New York City or the nearest town or whatever, and I get more money for it. And that was really the beginning of the formation of the kind of industrial food paradigm that we have now. And that is where apple diversity tanked. People started buying their food instead of growing it. And we just got this pipeline of pumping stuff in, and then diversity just, I'm sure early on there was a lot more diversity, but it just slowly fell away. When I was a little kid, all there was in the store that I ever saw was Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, and Newton Pippin. And Newton Pippin was my favorite, but it was actually picked completely green, just like Granny Smith is now. And eventually that was replaced by Granny Smith, and you saw almost nothing else for years after that. So that really kind of led to the loss of diversity, on a couple of points. First of all, the people who were growing less and less, and then the people who were eating were growing less and less and knew less and less, to the point where, again, when I started this breeding project, I would talk to just average people and they just had no idea there were a bunch of apples. It was just like the yellow, the green, and the red, and that's it. So now breeding programs are less and less, for home growers. Like, even when they use public funds, it's all about getting the right apple to feed into that system. And then the apple itself is kind of, a brand in itself. And that, by its nature, just because of its nature, that's what it does to survive and to thrive, because that's where the funding comes from. And that's kind of the major purpose. So we see less and less of this, like, the altruistic side, and the kind of the altruistic aspect of breeding is kind of withered away with that system. The estimates vary, but I've heard numbers as high as, I think, 15,000 apple varieties were growing in North America at one point, and of course most of those are missing in action. A lot of them are probably extinct, and other ones are sitting out there just any day. The last tree could go, so we've really lost a lot there because of embracing that system. And you can't really blame just one entity, like the system itself or something. Like, we participate in that system, and that's where our food comes from, and we're willing to hand over breeding and selection to that system, which is going to just be conservative by nature, then we're just asking for it, basically. That said, they do important work in these big breeding programs. The work they do is good. They're not like evil people or anything. They're doing good work. They just have to serve a narrow thing. And but we can take advantage of that, because great strides have been made in breeding, in quality in general, but also disease resistance in a great way. So we should definitely be taking advantage of those people. But it is inherently conservative. It will always narrow diversity. Even as it's become more diverse, we're seeing more diversity now finally in the stores. It's very, very narrow compared to what it could be and what it should be. Let me ask you this. So if, these statistics you hear, like 1 in 5,000 apples or 1 in 10,000 apples, I think those are real numbers, but what they mean is that there's so much criteria that has to be met by an apple to make it into that pipeline and get to the store and be a success, that even that 1 in 5,000, I don't think that there's no guarantee that's going to be successful. It's just that's what it takes to get launched. So if you have to grow 5,000 apples to get that one apple, do you think that one apple, the apple that you would want to grow and eat the most in your backyard? Like, pretty slim chance of that, right? So there's a lot more great apples that are being produced in these programs. It's just they're not making it out. So we should not use those apples that make it to the grocery store as the yardstick by which to judge our apples. What's important to us is, do we want to eat it? Do we want to grow it? And then if we do, we give it to other people. And if they like it, then it survives by a process of, like, natural selection. And that's what we should be going for. So, very importantly, it's up to no one but us to regain that diversity. And not only shouldn't anyone else do it, no one else can do it. It's not going to happen. You can't legislate it. You can't start a government program that's going to regain apple diversity for us. And there's no reason to. And why would we, when it's so much fun? Anyway. And the other thing is that this must be part of a vital food culture, because that's part of the problem. And what use is it if I grow a bunch of great apples, but they don't really go anywhere because people aren't growing, talking about, eating, selling, etc. So these 2 points are, essential. Like, yeah, there's no one else that's going to do it. There's no one else that should do it or can do it right. And it's not going to survive. The varieties aren't going to survive. The heirlooms aren't going to survive. Nothing's going to work right unless we have a vital food culture. And so I remember a friend going to France, and he was just so stoked that he could sit in a cafe and talk to some stranger about cheese for like 2 hours. Like talk about apples. I want to make a shirt that says talk about apples, and again, apples are just kind of a gateway to this idea that that's kind of how we should be living our lives. And if we accept the industrial food system as the only thing that feeds us and then produces the varieties to feed us, we're just asking for it. That's not a good idea. The other thing I want to say, let's see. Oh yeah. So far, all my stuff has been released into the public domain. That just means that there's no controls on it. It's not patented. You could graft it, sell it, grow it, graft trees and sell them, etc. And I'm not against patenting. The current patent system is 20 years, which isn't that long. And, in some cases, like if I could patent an apple and it would give me the funds to do other projects in this project, I don't have a problem with that. And also, if it was actually a success, more people would actually get to eat it, most likely. And I have one apple that could fit that. Like if you got Pink or Lady into the grocery stores next to Pink Lady and people bought it and ate it, they would come back for more, I'm pretty sure. But that's a long road, and I probably will never actually do it. But I'm not totally against it. And especially for larger scale breeders, like Marcus Cobalt comes to mind. He's a breeder in Europe, and he breeds all kinds of stuff, and he has a really big operation. Well, there has to be something coming in for him to be able to function. So if you say there should be no patenting at all, then you're just saying that he shouldn't exist unless you offer an alternative. And I do see a lot of in the fruit community of people saying that, you should be able to grow what you want or graft everything. But I see less conversations about how we compensate breeders and keep them going. And I have my own ideas about that, which I can't go into now because we don't have time. But something based more on social principles rather than legal principles. I think legal principles are generally the wrong direction to head. So another thing is there's a lot of intangible value to this project for me, and I think for anyone who engages in it. And I think this is really important because these intangible benefits are like getting outside, being involved with living things, being engaged like and making friends with other people, and then just having something to look forward to, because this is a long process. You're going to wait probably at least minimum 4 years to get a fruit, and more likely it's going to be like 6 to 8. So invest in something that is alive, and you have to nurture, and you have to wait for it, and it gives you something to look forward, and it gives you that like little kid waiting for Christmas morning, can't wait for Christmas morning to open the presents feeling in a big way. Although that drops off over time after you've cultivated a lot more patience from just waiting and waiting and waiting. So I think these intangible things are super important. And even if someone grows, say like 10 or 20 seedlings, and they end up with nothing like spectacular, they're going to end up with some edible stuff and probably some okay or good stuff. You can't really just dismiss that value that they've had by engaging in the project in the first place. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind and for people to experience. Another major goal of mine is accessibility. So I approach this really sloppy and dumb on purpose. I know nothing about plant breeding genetics to speak of. When people start talking about breeding, genetics and stuff, I just glaze over because it just doesn't interest me. But also I wanted to do this with the kind of dumbest logic possible of like just saying, oh, me have this apple, make go together. Maybe, these two flavors will mix together or something like that. Because a lot of people don't want to nerd out about it, me included. In a certain way, I don't nerd out about it. In other ways, I do. And I just wanted to demonstrate, even before I knew, I just very, very strongly suspected that I was going to show that you don't need to be sophisticated about it at all. You can just kind of go on your intuition, or even just plant seeds from really good apples that you like and grow them and be successful. And I think I've shown that now. And I continue to approach it that way because the other reason I do it that way is because my preference is just to be super autodidactic, not consume too much information, run on intuition rather than kind of a scientific mindset. I can do science. I have excellent logic skills. It just doesn't interest me that much. And when it comes to like reading scientific papers on breeding genetics of apples, I'd probably rather go to the dentist. That's like super boring for me. But it takes all kinds, and people are just going to do it the way is kind of their nature. So people who like to nerd out on statistics and information and math and stuff, they're going to do it their way, and it takes all kinds, and that's great. Everyone just does it their own way. But I think I've demonstrated that you don't have to, and that if we just all approach it without really any knowledge at all, and just take good apples and cross them together, we're going to get an enormous amount of amazing diversity and new stuff that people have never tasted before. And that's very encouraging. All right, let's talk about traits and categories and pursuing them. This is the fun stuff. Apples have an extreme variability. I think most people watching this know that when grown from seed. And that diversity is not just in the fruit, but it's in the entire plant. Now, this is often cast in a negative light because people are like, hey, well, don't plant an apple from seed because you're not going to get the same apple. Well, you don't need to. We have ways to do that. You graft it, you can root a cutting, or if it's not on a rootstock, you can pull up a sucker. My friend, Mr. Chickadee on YouTube, all his neighbors in Kentucky, they said that's the way that they always propagated apples, is someone would grow a good apple and they were from seed usually, and people would go and pull up suckers and take them home and plant them. Anyway, we don't need to do that. We can get exactly the same apple over and over again and make 50 billion copies by cloning. However, when we're breeding apples, this is an entirely different goal. And then it's amazing. This is the best thing ever for a plant breeder, to have a species that just throws enormous diversity, and that's what makes apples so fun, is we have this enormous diversity. And I think, again, it's through the whole plant, like the colors and the shapes and the bark texture and everything. And I think it's worth paying attention to those other traits, just because once we know all of them and we have them kind of cataloged, we may be able to use them in creative ways by just, insert creativity, basically. So this is a batch of maypole seedlings, and that's a red flesh columnar crab. And it just throws a lot of interesting color, leaf color. So imagine taking this and doing like a Belgian fence, which is like, you plant a bunch of apples this way and a bunch this way, and you sort of weave them together into this fence. Imagine having that with like different color patterns going through it, maybe all yellow this way, all red this way, or a block of yellow, a block of red, etc. Or just taking a tree and grafting like a 1 foot stick, and then another 1 foot stick on top of that, another one, just stack it up in different colors. And you'd have this crazy like totem pole effect, in the fall. So I just think we should be thinking about that stuff. For ornamental stuff like that, or flowers, color and flower size, there's actually been quite a bit of breeding in that direction, but it's just for ornamental crabs. So we can take that work and build on it and create, apples that have large, nice fruit, or just nice fruit, that also have these cool characteristics. There's also like a red flesh crab on a regular apple tree, just for contrast. All right, let's talk about fruit, though. Apples have the broadest flavor profile of any fruit that I know of, certainly in cooler regions. Flavors like watermelon, citrus. I've tasted pine, berries, banana, pineapple, spices. Often it's cinnamon. Sometimes it's just like a generic spice flavor. Almonds, anise, rose, grape. I have a apple called hard candy cider that occasionally tastes like purple grape, like artificial purple grape. The malty flavor of Wixon, that like savory malty flavor. I've got one this year that's musky. It's super odd. It's just like this kind of sharp, weird musky flavor. It's quite strong actually, but it's really intriguing and good, and I like it. And I was thinking, wow, this, there's probably others out there that I don't know about, but just this one apple could be the basis of a new category of apples, like musky apples, which I will definitely be pursuing. Cherry. So I have this apple is crossed between cherry cox and grenadine, and it inherited the cherry flavor of cherry cox. And I'd kind of laid off this cross. This is like one of the 2011 crosses, because I just didn't know if that flavor was going to translate. But it did. And as soon as I tasted this apple, I was like, this year, I was like all over the place with the cherry cox pollen. And I only have 2 cherry flavored apples, which is Sweet 16, which is kind of like fleeting, sometimes not, and cherry cox. So I've always crossed those together. And if anyone else has any other cherry flavored apples, I want them for breeding. Texture. So now I think people just think, the average person just thinks that there's super crisp apples and then there's bad apples, but there's all kinds of textures in between that are perfectly edible and even interesting. One is rubbery. The apples, especially as they age, instead of going mealy or mushy or something, they get this kind of odd rubbery texture. They can even get super dehydrated, like I think Roxbury russet comes to mind. And then they just get rubbery. But there's also just apples that are tender. Some are super fine grained, some are coarse grained. Not much else to say about that. Flesh color. Everybody's excited about red fleshed apples for good reason, but it's not just about the color, it's about the flavor. I call it red flesh flavor. Often it's like a fruit punch flavor or a generic mixed berry flavor. The one I've been able to pick out the most is strawberry, and I only have it in 2 seedlings. One is Grenadine X King David, black strawberry it's called. And then the other one is Pinker Lady, which is Pink Lady X Rubiot. And I'll definitely be crossing those together. So yeah, it's about the flavor really. And it doesn't seem to correlate completely to like the redness of the apple. Like sometimes redder apples are stronger flavored, but I do have very, very red apples that don't have a ton of that flavor. And then say like black strawberry, which is super flavorful, but it's more like a mottled pink color. There's also other colors. So Chris and I have talked about, he's brought up like, what if we take like the orange and yellow fleshed apples and cross them with red fleshed apples, or cross them with each other and start making complex hybrids with those and pile them together? What's going to happen there? Super interesting. Again, you know, we're pioneers. This is like open territory for us to explore. So yeah, flesh colors are interesting. There's Pinker Lady. And this is something I call Becca's crab. I think it's a Malus prunifolia. I'm definitely interested in breeding with this and have been. These apples are really cool because you can just eat the whole apple. It's like a little cherry or something. And it's a little edgy, you know, but it's really good. A lot of people, I fed them to a lot of people and they like them. I like having them on the counter and just munching them whole. And talk about superfoods like antioxidants, phytonutrients, plus you get the cyanic compounds in the seeds that are anti-cancer. Yeah. Season. Okay, so this is Pink Parfait, one of Albert Edder's apples that here ripens in the wintertime usually, sometimes as early as November, but it kind of tends to hang on and keep improving well after that. I ate this apple. It was excellent, perfect condition. So season now here at my homestead, off the tree fresh, is July to February 1st. Let that sink in for a minute. That's super cool. I think that it's going to be easy to extend that further. It's going to be hard to get it a lot earlier, but we can improve the quality of early apples. We're going to talk about both of those things presently. Small apples, they're going to be a thing. They're good. Apples like chestnut crab, Wixon, Centennial, off favorite apple lists. And that's more interesting just because there aren't very many of them. And that quality and interest comes from the crab genetics that are in them. But I think small apples have a future. I think they have a future in commercial breeding and grocery stores even. Koyama Orchards took a chance on one of Albert Edder's apples called Crimson Gold and started growing that commercially. And now you can buy that in grocery stores around the country. And if anyone's tasted a savory apple, it's usually going to be Wixon or Crimson Gold. And people come back for more because they're really good. So I was in the store one day and I saw this a plastic tube full of apples, kind of like a tennis ball holder. And there were these little apples. And I thought, wow, someone did it. I've been saying for years that somebody should, start growing and marketing small apples in the grocery stores. So I bought one and I bit into it, and I was so disappointing because it's just another little boring. It's like they took, because often these small apples are more flavorful and more interesting and sweeter. But this is like they took the apple and shrunk a regular apple and shrunk it down. It looks just like a big conical grocery store apple, but it just tastes exactly like one too, and not any better. So that was rather disappointing. It's called Rocket. But I think there is a future in the crab genetics and the super high quality that some of these apples bring, and we'll talk more about that too presently. Appearance. So appearance is never like a major thing for me, but it's cool. I mean, this is black strawberry. It looks amazing. And yeah, when I get something like this, it makes me a little bit more interested in appearance. So I think if we take this was crossed with King David, which is nearly black if it's in the sun here, very, very dark, what we call black apples. But I think if we take that kind of class of, Oxford black, King David, Arkansas black, stuff like that, and cross it with red flush apples, I think this is what we're going to get. And I have a suspicion for a long time that looks like it may be panning out. I'm not sure yet, that if we cross these super dark red apples that have some kind of pigmentation gene with red flushed apples, we're more likely to get red flushed apples as offspring. So we'll see how that proves out in the future. But for now, yeah, cross these type of apples with red flushed apples. There's other characteristics like, in terms of appearance that might be worth chasing if that interests you. Not a big thing for me, but yeah, and there's other things like keeping ability, sugar and acid, tannins. We're going to skip over that stuff. Okay, so cultural stuff, breeding for regional needs. This is January russet, which is ripens in January here. This would probably be useless in most climates in the United States, except for like the Pacific coast and then, the South and stuff like that. But for me, late hanging apples are a miracle and they're great. And I've invested heavily in breeding more of them. So disease, for instance, is a big deal, right? People ask me all the time, they're like, what do you do about cedar apple rust? What do you do about this fire blight? And I'm just like, nothing. I don't spray anything. I'm lazy. If I had all those problems, I probably wouldn't even grow apples. My worst problem is scab, which I do breed a little bit for scab. But yeah, for some people, it's like the disease pressure is so high that you need resistant varieties to just about grow anything or not have to just spray it all the time. So that's something, if I was in one of those areas, I would be collecting every apple I could that's disease resistant to whatever diseases you have, and then take those and inject interesting characteristics into them. That's the trick, right? Get other things that are super interesting and put those in, the red flesh, the savory flavors, really strong, interesting flavors. And then once you get those and you've injected that into lines, and you can work with those going forward and create more interesting apples instead of just another, version of the same Gold Rush, Liberty, or whatever it is. Okay, so cold, extreme cold. This is Trailman. I know a guy that grows this in Anchorage, Alaska. This is a great parent to use if you have extreme cold because, very, very few apples will survive those climates. But again, it's like take those and start injecting interesting genes into them and see where that takes you. And there's more than this, but Trailman's a good example. So that's another example of just, breeding for your regional needs. Sunburn's a terrible problem here. This is one of my seedlings called Flaxen. Might get a name change to Pink Lemonade. I may not even grow this apple here because it's just so prone to sunburn. You can see the leaves are burned and not just the fruit. We had like 112 day, and this tree just got hammered. Like everything even in a normal summer that exposed to the sun is going to get severe sunburn here. So that's kind of a no-go for us. Another one is just adaptability. So some apples just have a broad adaptability to different climates. So I think that's going to become more important with climate change. I don't know about you guys, but I've been watching my climate go wonky for the last 20 years, and it just seems to get weirder and weirder. So having fruits, that's just a great trait, right? It also just means that if you have a really good apple, you can send it all over the place and it's probably going to do well, which is not often the case. I have tons and tons of heirlooms here, and a lot of them just do not perform well. So there's other stuff like, the growth habits, bearing habits. Are they good pollinators? Are they easily pollinated, which they aren't all? Flowers, like here, this is maple, has beautiful, huge flowers. And why not, if we can, breed ornamental, gorgeous trees that also have amazing fruit. All right, let's talk about categories. This is really fun. So a category I'm trying to coin recently is savory apples. And these all come from the Edder line that includes like Wixon, Amoroso, Muscat Divinus, Crimson Gold. I'm forgetting something, but yeah, that whole line. And I think that flavor, the savory flavor, comes from some kind of crab. And hopefully we'll know exactly what that is now, so we can go back to the well with that crab instead of just reusing, these few apples. So how this works, it just took me a long time to figure out what was going on with these apples, because they have this richness that kind of grows in your mouth. And the closest description I'd ever seen was by Adam of Adam's Apples blog, which is really cool. Check him out. Shout out to Adam at Adam's Apples. And he called it malty. And now the interesting thing about malt is malt contains the savory or umami component. So umami or savory is the fifth flavor. There's like salty, bitter, sweet, sour, and savory, or umami is the Japanese term. And you find this characteristic in other foods like meats. If you think of taking a bite of just like a super good steak or like a braised mushroom, it's in malt again. It's in red wine, aged cheese. Like if you take a super good aged cheese that just has a lot of that flavor and you start eating it, you just want to like savor it as a verb, right? Savor is actually a verb, and it actually has like behaviors, like you chew it and you want to get it in more of your mouth so that you taste it and it hits all the flavor spots. Because I think that part of what's going on is the umami flavor does hit more taste buds and different taste buds than like these high fruit notes. So it does that for apples too. If you have an apple that's all aromatics, all higher aromatics, often they rise up really fast in the front of the flavor, or the front of your mouth even, and then they drop off pretty quick. But this is something that kind of grows, and I'll feed these apples to people and just watch them, and you can see them kind of take a bite and they're chewing, and then they start paying attention, and they're like, wow, that's really rich, and it's like growing on the palate. So these apples are amazing, and they're going to be a thing, and I'm going to do everything I can to promote them more and breed more of them. Right now, I would say probably if I counted up all the ones that I know about, half or more of them were bred by either me or Freddie Menge. This one here is called Amber Wine. I just fruited that actually for the first time last year and named it like the first year. It's a cross between Williams Pride and Vixen. Okay, that's one of the other Edder apples is Vixen. And it has that component. When it's ripe, it's really delicious and great. Excuse me here. And Bite Me also has it. So another thing about this flavor component is that it can carry the whole apple. I guess that's a good way to put it. So if you took that flavor out of Bite Me, it would be like a no-go. I wouldn't propagate it probably or anything. I have other apples too where that's the only thing that makes them interesting at all, but it can make them very interesting. So that's really cool. And I think that if you took these modern boring crisp apples that they just keep cranking out without like a lot of distinguishing characteristics or flavor, and just injected this one trait into that, like into your Honey Crisp or Cosmic Crisp or whatever, it would just really expand it and make it way more interesting and yummy. And I think we should definitely be doing exactly that. But also in other places. Now, I'm not sure that it's going to mix with every other flavor. One of my seedlings, Cherub, has this odd mix of the savory flavor, but with fruit flavors and rose and other stuff. And it's a little peculiar at times, But I think just taking any of this and just putting it in everything And Wixon's a great parent for that. I've sent out thousands of open pollinated Wixon seedlings. And remember, this is the very first one that I fruited right here, and it was good. So think of what's going to come out of those. So the groundwork's already laid. I've already made lots of other crosses with Wixon, Vixen, Muscat divinus. Muscat divinus is a good parent because it's really, really strong. It's like the queen of umami flavor. So yeah, the groundwork's already laid. We're just basically waiting for them to fruit at this point. Crab genetics. This is Centennial. Centennial is delicious, along with, chestnut crab and Wixon. Again, these show up on people's favorite apple lists all the time because they're just super good. It is not going to be hard to make new apples with crab genetics. Like, just if we take those few apples and start crossing them together, Trailman is another one. We're going to get great stuff out of that. And again, I've already done that a lot, so the groundwork's already laid. But with going back to other crabs, like primitive crabs, and bringing them into the mix and different species, there's lots of different species of crabs we can experiment. So this is my crab cherub. It's crossed between Wixon and Rubaiyat. I have 3 Wixon Rubaiyat crosses in a row in my trial bed, and all 3 of them, there's more than that, but 3 that have fruited, and all 3 of them seem promising. I was just eating one yesterday. So, yeah, I don't think it's going to be hard. Like, I think this apple here, that pool of really good dessert crabs is pretty small as it is, but I think that this can compete with those best ones already. And we're just getting started. So we're going to have a lot more fun, small crab derived stuff. Russets. Most of you guys know here that are watching this that russets are amazing. But this is one of the things that modern breeding programs have just really tried to breed out of apples, is the russet characteristic. And as a result, they've really fallen by the wayside. Where they used to be super popular, people now would think something's wrong with the apple, but if they taste it, they just need to be educated, and they taste it and they'll change their mind. I would love to breed a red flesh russet based on golden russet. I'm making crosses in that direction already. They're great with cheese. This is an Ashmead's kernel ex Appaloosa. Appaloosa is a seedling of mine that's Grenadine ex Lady Williams. And yeah, red flesh russets, but just russets in general. Not only should we save the russets, but we should improve them. Why not? Everything can be improved. At least that's what I think. This one just has interesting russeting. This is a seedling of mine called Dutch Master, which I think you could probably see on my wall here, painting of. And it's just really pretty. So I wouldn't really call this a classic russet apple, but russeting is cool. It can be really beautiful and interesting looking. Late hanging apples. Okay, most people wouldn't know the pink lady can be hung on the tree very late, and it actually ripens really late if you let it ripen on the tree and don't pick it and put it in cold storage and ripen it there. If you look closely at this picture, you can see there's ice in the stem well. This is New Year's Day, ground's frozen. I crunched my way out there, pick it off the tree, and it was crisp and delicious and perfect and better than the ones you get in the store. So late hanging apples. For me, in this climate, they're just a miracle, and I think we can push them much further. The latest ripening I have is about February 1st. Not that I don't have a few on the tree after that, but that's kind of the limit now. But this apple that I have pollen from here, March Hedge, I've seen it as late as March on the tree, and it's just a little tree in a hedgerow at the top of my driveway. This guy in Germany sent me pollen from this, and he sent me this other picture of the apples and the flowers on the tree at the same time in April, and he said that these apples were still crisp. And so I'm going to get that variety as well and more pollen, and I've already made crosses with that. So I'm pretty sure that we can have late hanging apples into spring, possibly into and through April, which would be absolutely amazing. I'm pretty sure that's achievable. I'm already working on it. It's not going to fly everywhere. A lot of places, those apples are just going to freeze on the tree. But wherever you can do that, which is still a sizable area of the country, a lot of the Pacific Northwest, and then the belt along the south, and of course other parts of the world, Mediterranean climates. Yeah, very interesting. I'm super into this. Most of the seedlings I planted last year were along those lines. For early apples, I don't think it's going to be very possible to, get them way, way earlier. We're not going to probably get them in the spring, or at least not anything worth eating. But the classic early apple is pretty bad. Just thin, low sugar, acidic, not all that great in general, probably more for cooking. But we do have better stuff from breeding programs. Chestnut crab is one that ripens in August. This is Williams Pride, which I can start eating here in sometime in July and then through August. Williams Pride is excellent. It's been throwing a really good offspring for me. I think it's a great one to try to breed stuff that, you know, maybe isn't way earlier, but is just better quality for the early apples. Red flesh. Again, you know, it's about the flavor. And there's, I think, tends to be some negative characteristics that come along with the red flesh, just because we're dealing with fairly primitive apples that hadn't been worked with very much. And Albert Etter laid some good groundwork on that. I actually have not collected very many red fleshed apples. I've been pretty happy to work with the stuff I got from, you know, Etter's stuff. Chris Semantics has sent me quite a few that I have growing now. But anyway, there are more, and the quality's coming up. They're coming into stores now, and they've obviously bred stuff that's good enough to put in stores. I haven't had Ruby Glow yet, the new one that's come out, but I hear it's really good. This is one of my seedlings, Apple USA. And you can see if you look at the skin there, it looks just like its parent grenadine. Like some years you could confuse it for grenadine. I think it's going to prove to be an improvement on grenadine, and that's enough for me to carry it forward. I use it in breeding already. And there's Pinker Lady. So this is an example of an apple that doesn't seem to have any of those negative characteristics of red-fleshed apples. So I think, you know, it's just going to take a while to kind of tease out the stuff we want and leave the stuff we don't want behind. And this is a good start. And this is how we build, right? So now I take this and I put it onto other stuff or other red-fleshed apples that are showing great promise and our improvement, and see what we end up getting in the long run. And here's one I just ate the other day. First time, King David X Rubaiyat, very promising. It's a little underripe, but already super edible, very crisp, very delicious, lots of nice flavor. And it's going to happen. The groundwork's laid, stuff's already out. I saw that Derek Mills is doing a talk soon on red-fleshed apples. That should be very interesting. He's been at that for a long time. And he's collected a lot too, a lot of varieties that I don't know anything about. This is my face when tasting My Jewel. So My Jewel is an apple that was bred in California or selected probably quite a while ago, maybe in the 30s or 40s or something. It is the most intensely banana flavored apple I've ever tasted, like artificial banana candy. It's just crazy. And not my favorite flavor, but it's interesting. And I still want to breed banana flavored apples just because I'm just fascinated by the idea that we could produce really high quality apples that have just really extreme flavors. So let's talk about extreme flavors. Another thing Chris Semantics and I have talked about quite a bit is just taking these super flavorful apples, the most flavorful apples, and just crossing them together and then crossing them again and just piling those genes up. I think that we're probably going to end up with just extremely high flavored apples. You know, I don't know what to call them. It'd be nice to have a name for this category of apples, just to have a box for them so they're easier to talk about. Flavor dense came up on my Patreon account from somebody when I asked there. But yeah, just extremely high flavored apples. And, you know, I do have other ones going. This is one I call hard candy cider. And it's a cross between grenadine and Lady Williams. And Lady Williams is quite fruity if anyone's tasted it when it's really ripe. It has a pretty good complex fruit flavor. And this thing, hard candy cider, is like taking a handful of different flavored fruit hard candies and putting them all in your mouth at the same time. And the things I picked out the most, when I can pick something out, is like artificial watermelon and artificial purple grape. So, you know, I'm already crossing this with other stuff to find out what happens. Here's hard candy cider with Appaloosa, both very strongly flavored apples. These, interesting, have exactly the same parent. So this is a back cross, which is common in breeding. A lot of breeding is really just kind of inbreeding. So yeah, Wittig Pippin is another one that I'm really interested in. And I have just a small handful of them, but Chris has some more. And I'm just going to keep getting more of those and trying to cross them together. So there's other things like animal feed, sweetings, which are just apples that are super sweet for growing sugar. And of course, my new category, musky apples. Yes. So yeah, how do we do it? Talk about that. So I'm just going to run through the process super quick. We're getting toward the end of this talk. So how it works in brief. Collect pollen. So I collect these when they're still closed, open them up, and use a comb to scrape off the little boy parts there, which make the pollen. When those dry, they release the pollen. I will usually, at this point, I scrape them off with a comb, and I put them in a paper packet, and then I just set the packet on the counter and let it dry slowly. It's preferable if they dry a little bit slow. If it's an emergency, you can dry them in the sun and get just enough pollen to do some pollinations, but you want to usually dry them slow for like a day or two. And then we make pollinations. So you can do that a lot of different ways. In this one, I've actually taken off all the anthers because I thought I needed to early on. You can actually see the pollen on the girl parts there in the middle. That's where the pollen germinates and grows down the tube and starts the whole process. Interesting thing about pollinating is that you can have different parents in the mix and get different parents in the seeds, just like with a dog, you can get different colored puppies. So if that's pretty cool because you can take a pollen blend. I try to make these pollen blends that have a bunch of interesting, say like red fleshed apples or savory apples or strong flavored apples. And then you can apply that to one apple, get the seeds from one apple and have a bunch of diversity in there. So lately I've been using this system of isolation. Most of the time I've not used any isolation, actually. I just pull the petals off and assume the bees won't visit. And then one day I was pollinating and I saw a bee land on the thing I just pollinated with no petals, and then it went to another one and another one. And I was like, okay, I guess I have to isolate now. So this is Wixen X rubeat, which is the same cross that Cherub came from, and just imagine how many good apples are going to come out of just this batch of seeds. So what I do is I take these organza bags, they come into up 20-inch size, I put it over, I seal it before anything's blooming, before any of the flowers are open, and then I'll take that off, pollinate, put it back, do that like, 3 or 4 days, and then that's the end of that, and it's totally isolated for the rest of the season. Label, you must label. And the convention is the seed parent goes first and the pollen parent goes second. That's important because if anyone wants to use that information, while I don't do that kind of sophisticated breeding or calculating or anything, someone else might want to. So it's good to have that information available. Collect the seeds. The seeds need to be stratified, which means they need to be go through some chill so they think the winter has gone by. And you can do that in the fridge. If the seed's dry, you have to soak it first and then put it in the fridge and chill it, or you can just do that outside if it's cold. Plant the seeds. I usually grow these out. Excuse me, I have to fix this here. I think we have a problem here.
Did your slides drop off?
Yeah, I'm just having a hard time getting past this slide. It doesn't want to go to the next slide. And I'm unable to get to my desktop here. Give me a second.
You could stop your screen share for a moment and see if you can advance to it and then bring it back on.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Give me a second. Oh, I got it. Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. Okay, here we go. I usually grow them out in flats. You can put them in the ground. It's just they're really vulnerable in the ground. So, I like to do them in flats. And then we're about this size. I'll transplant them out. This is my bed from this year of seedlings, and grow them out in there for a year so you can take them and graft them out somewhere. These are grafted just under like a nursery row for a year in a garden bed. You can put them straight into your trial rows if you take good care of them, but this is a little more safe and it's easier to like shade them while their grafts are healing and starting to grow. This is seedlings grafted onto a foundation tree. So we'll talk, I'll answer the question about whether to use rootstocks, own roots, or foundation trees going forward. And then you have to wait. So you wait and you wait and you wait for years. And then it's time to assess. So this is my mom. She's one of my tasters. And this is me tasting apples in videos over and over and over again. It's pretty fun work, I have to say. And sometimes they need time to show their potential. So don't discard stuff in the first year. It can be actually unlike what it's going to be in the long run sometimes in the first year. Okay, so then we take the best stuff and we continue it forward. Here's Pinker Lady. I'm real excited to breed with this. I had almost no flowers this year, just a few, and I got like maybe 3 flowers, and I took the pollen. I was able to make a bunch of cross pollinations because it really doesn't take that much pollen. So, and that's what it's about, right? Building on that. So now it gets exciting, right? I get the stuff that is really good, and I get to continue working with that. So selection versus breeding. So selection would be like you take a bunch of open pollinated seeds, you plant them, and you pick out whatever's good. And breeding is, being more specific about it, choosing your parents, choosing, second generation crosses. Thinking ahead a little bit is a good idea to what am I going to do with this cross later on. This is King David, an excellent parent and a top 10 apple here. Choose good parents. The thing about regaining apple diversity is we can do it faster, really fast, and we can do it way better by being selective about what we plant. So at the very least, again, pick something that's a really good apple and preferably make cross pollinations, and we're going to make extremely rapid progress. I think there could be I could do a whole talk probably on just like different parents and traits and categories and that sort of stuff. And that best apple is not always going to be the most excellent dessert apple, right? It could just be something that has a characteristic, like some really primitive crab that's super disease resistant or has a special color or a special flavor. But just choosing them intentionally is the point. If possible, collect and assess as much as you can. Albert Etter collected 500, I think he said, ish apples, and he called them a harem scarum lot, meaning that most of them were not very good. That's also been my experience with heirloom apples, and it could largely be just because they don't do good in your area. But the more you know about the apple and its traits, the better decisions you can make about crossing. And like I only use stuff that does well in my area. So if I was just going by book learning, I'd be using all kinds of stuff that doesn't do well in my area. This is the original Franken tree that, like, right after I moved here, I started grafting stuff on it and collecting varieties. If you've ever heard the term or used the term Franken tree, as far as I know, that came from this tree right here. My friend Spring was over at a party and she's like, "Oh, that's your Franken tree." And the name kind of stuck and it's been there ever since. Another good way to do trials is the diagonal cordon system. So these are planted 18 inches apart and they're tilted at a diagonal. You could also just grow them straight, but these fruit really, really fast. If you use dwarfing rootstock, I use Bud 9. And you could also grow it halfway up the trellis and then graft on another variety and go further. You could even take that further, but I wouldn't. Also, once they're established, they make great foundation trees, and you can take all these little side branches, clip them off, graft on new stuff, and get fruit really quick. So that's a good way to go. As far as heirlooms versus modern, use what's good, period. Definitely don't get it in this idea of the romanticized heirloom thing, because a lot of them really are not very good. They could use improvement, and use modern apples, use whatever's good. And it's good to, plan ahead for multi-generations and just think of injecting, interesting traits into lines and going from there. So what's the path forward for this unintentional movement? I think just having kind of like a movement a folk movement, a grassroots movement of apple breeding that kind of grows out organically and naturally over time is what we need exactly. The American apple diversity was probably created by just a complete chaos of seedlings. Most of the rootstock in those days was seedlings. So if you planted 1,000 orchard of 1,000 trees, you were planting 1,000 seedlings. And what happens when that's abandoned, or the tree blows over, or it just sprouts a sucker and you keep cutting it down, but it keeps growing back, which is where Red Delicious came from. Exactly. A sad day, but And anyway, so I think that we just need to plant a lot of seeds, but we need to plant seeds from good stuff, and we need to do cross pollinations. Inspiration is important. That's easy to me. All I do is make videos, and people can tell I'm enthusiastic about it. It looks fun. They want to do it, and they start doing it. Education, I plan on producing more material in the future, not only videos, but maybe some other stuff and some facts, maybe even a book. So, that's not hard either. The information's already out there. Again, I didn't cover much of that here, but it's all on my YouTube channel. And then for me, and I hope other people in the future, providing seeds, pollen, and scion wood, just, sharing the genetic material, getting it out there. And that's going to be key too. The more we do that, the faster the progress we're going to make, That's all there is to it. And I'd like to do a lot more of that, but I can't really expand beyond what I do now until I have someone helping out with that. Networking. I talked to Scott F. Smith of growingfruit.org. Shout out to growingfruit.org and Scott. That is an excellent community. I highly recommend it if you haven't been there. About doing a forum on apple breeding, or maybe pome breeding. So quince, pears, apples. And it's time. That needs to happen because there's enough people interested. The only place where we kind of communicate and not really is on my videos that I know of, and maybe some on that forum. So having a central place so we can communicate and especially share genetic material and just have conversations would be great. I'm willing to help set that up, but I won't be able to moderate it. So we need moderators. I honestly probably won't even participate that much because I have so many other irons in the fire and I spend way too much online already, but I'll definitely participate. But it's time for that to happen. So I'll be talking to Scott soon about that and see if we can make that happen. If not there, then somewhere else. So.
All right. Well, can we switch over to some questions?
Yeah. I have 4 common questions that I could just answer real quick that are just the most common questions. You want me to rip through those first?
Yeah, I think that will knock out some of the ones already there.
Okay. How long does it take? The fastest I've seen any of mine fruit is 4 years. I know one other guy that got some apples in 3 years. And more typically, you're going to be looking at 6 to 8 is kind of going to be the average area. And I have stuff that hasn't fruited for, I think, 11 years now, but that's the exception. The other question is own roots. Should you grow them on their own roots, rootstock, or foundation trees? I've never grown much on its own roots, but people say, and I would assume it's probably true, that they're going to take longer than on a dwarfing rootstock. Dwarfing rootstocks, I use bud 9 and M9 size. I plant them. We'll get to that in a minute. And I think it probably gets fruit faster, but it's still not fast, definitely. The other option is to put them on foundation trees. One thing you have to be careful if you're putting them on a foundation tree, make sure it doesn't have virus, because say you put 20 seedlings on there, they're going to have virus forever unless you can put them through the complicated process of undoing that. So foundation trees, some people say that they'll fruit faster. I've been told that many times. No one's been able to give me specific personal information of their success about it. It has not been my experience that they fruit faster, but the idea is that the hormones are already in the tree, it's already producing, and it tricks the scion into thinking it's sexually mature and mature enough to fruit. So I set up a tree that just has all these crazy grafts on it. I put 80 plus grafts on one tree of all different seedlings. I would do things like graft them onto a fruit spur, bend it over, and then graft the tip into another fruit spur. Just all kinds of weird loops and crazy stuff. And I thought, if none of that works, then I'm definitely going to scrap that idea. I know Freddie Menge was visiting and I asked him about it and he said no before I finished the question. I was like, is it faster? And he's like, no, he's shaking his head already. So we'll see. I don't think it's going to pan out, but we'll see. What percentage are good? So this is about benchmarks. Who's tasting it? What category of apple is it? For me, a mediocre red fleshed apple ranks higher than a mediocre just regular dessert apple or something like that. So yeah, who's tasting it? What are your benchmarks? It's just hard to say, but I would say if you're going through my trial rows or someone's trial rows, like 50% of them are like worth eating if you're just want an apple, or if you were out hiking and found a tree or something like that. What percent are great? I don't know, but it's not, I'm keeping a lot of stuff, like a surprising amount of stuff, and naming it. And finally, how far apart in the rows? My stuff on dwarfing rootstocks is 12 inches apart in the row, and the rows are 6 feet apart, preferably oriented north to south. And I wouldn't put them any closer than that, but I would do that again, but trellis them. I didn't trellis mine. I never got them trellised, and they're just an absolute mess in there. So there's 4 common questions that answered. Let's go for it. What else you got?
That's great. Thank you. I think everybody's enjoying this a lot. 2 things I wanted to make mention, because we get this right out of the way. Ernie D said there's an apple called Seneca Crisp. I don't know if that's just a rename or whatever, from Red Jacket Orchard in Geneva, New York, that has a cherry flavor.
All right. I want to get that.
Yeah, there you go. Where do we get the scion, right?
Yeah.
And
or at least
Ernie D also says, how's the black strawberry and cherub breeding / seeds going?
I definitely crossed those 2 together. I don't know what'll come of that. They do have different red flesh parents, which I tend to go for. I don't, very rarely will I like pile grenadine on itself by backbreeding, because I'm trying to get away from grenadine. I'll probably never use grenadine again, because I have things like black strawberry and Appaloosa and others that are an improvement. But it's just a waiting game. I have some of those. Do I have some sprouted out and grafted out? I probably have some at least in this year's seedling bud, but again, the waiting part. Lots of that.
Janet asked a question about, she was talking about weeding out trees based on disease. And so can you talk about some things? So selection and calling is always important in any plant breeding project. Can you speak about that, and then maybe relation to vigor or early observations that you make based on your conditions, and maybe how that's climatically different for different people in different places?
Well, I'm hesitant to weed out weak trees unless they're just super weak and they're pretty much going to die, for a couple reasons. One is I could have a genetic dwarf, like it could just be a low vigor apple. The other thing is it could have just got a bad start in life. Maybe its roots got damaged and there's some reason, and I'm always just super curious. Like when I started this, I was just too curious to call anything. Now I'm kind of like, oh, well, if this seedling doesn't get planted, it's no big deal. But I don't do a lot of that pre-culling stuff. I know other people will select for red leaves. I don't do that because most of the other stuff doesn't have red leaves anyway. So that's about all I really have to say for that. As far as disease, you'll see powdery mildew a lot in the beginning, but apples tend to outgrow that, so I don't pay too much attention. I don't call for scab because there's so few super scab resistant apples anyway that, you'd be calling a lot of stuff.
Maybe do you want to talk about type 1 red flesh versus type 2? And so Edder's a lot of type 2 stuff.
Yeah, I don't actually know that much about that. I think you know more about that. So
type 2 is basically for people, it's where the wood isn't red, basically. So you can actually I think what you were making mention is you can get rid of interesting high quality apples early on by just focusing on red leaves or red wood.
Oh yeah, for certain. If you're breeding with the Edder stuff, for sure, or with that, there you go, the type 2 or whatever.
Dan asks, could you wax on a little bit about savory apples? I know that's something you're very passionate about.
I just think the potential is huge. So my friend at the apple farm, Tim Bates, in Philo here is nearby. He has interns every year on his apple farm. They have, dozens and dozens of varieties, all kinds of stuff. And he says invariably when interns leave, Wixon is their favorite apple. And what does it have going for it? Yeah, it's tart. Yeah, it's a little bit fruity, but it's the savory flavor that carries the apple. And like I said, you can take that and put it in an absolutely boring apple and it becomes intriguing. And it's intriguing because the flavor grows and it keeps developing on the palate, and it makes you want to chase after it, and then it makes you want another bite. I noticed this with Bite Me early on, and like I said, literally watching people's responses, which I do as much as possible. I like to feed apples to people that's part of my process. I can see their gears turning, and I can see that process, and I can see them undergoing these physical things that we do, just the animalistic things of savoring something. Again, like if you think of a really good red wine, you take a sip and you just want to swirl it around your mouth and hold it there and savor it. And it does the same thing for apples. And these things are going to be popular. I'm telling you, again, we just need to do the work, but the groundwork's already laid. Literally probably thousands maybe of seedlings are in the ground or grafted somewhere.
Speaking of seedlings and seed, there was a question from an anonymous person about, and this is going to be two-part. I'm going to combine two things together. But first is they were looking at when you do pollination, generally how many seeds do you get from there? And then maybe you could talk about some of the deformities in the seed that show up sometimes, or reasons why you throw the seed away. And then secondly, Andrew was asking, he's working up in Canada, starting a breeding project, some of the apples he's been collecting around his area. And could you speak a little bit more about how you start your seeds, how you store your seeds, stuff like that? And then maybe in the third, and then when do you transplant seedlings and whatnot? I think we have addressed the grafting or not issue. And the third is, where can you get scion and seed? So it's kind of a three-parter. Where can you get it from?
No, I can't even remember the first thing you said, so we're gonna have to break.
The first one was, when you do a pollination, generally how much seed do you get from that, and then what's qualities do you look for in the seed to plant? Because there's flattened seed or deformed seed.
I'll plant anything that looks like it's going to grow, pretty much, just to see why not, see what happens. If it fails to thrive, so what? As far as the pollination, I've really noticed that varieties vary a lot in how well they take pollination. Like this year, my chestnut crab crosses hardly produced any seed. I'd have whole bags full that just did not take at all. While other ones, like you saw that picture of the Wixon Rubaiyat, is just those things are probably packed full of seeds, right? So that just varies a lot. It could be 10, 2 per, it can be higher, it just really varies. A lot of times when you're doing these cross pollinations, if your pollen's maybe not good, there could be an incompatibility. You might get one seed in an apple. That happens quite a bit. But yeah, I'll plant anything that looks like it's plump enough to grow, usually, personally.
And then Andrew is asking about some more particulars around starting seed. I personally use 50 count deep trays. Or nursery tree. There's tree tube pots that are small. They're about an inch by 4 inches, but people use community pots. I've done that before. Or community beds. So could you talk a little about that? About how do you grow seedlings and when do you transplant? We've already talked about the grafting versus not grafting part.
I'll tend to go in flats. The best thing that's worked for me is to plant the seeds early, during the winter in an unheated greenhouse. So it's cold enough that they're still getting chill, but they've already been through some chill in the fridge. And I just use flats because that's how I start veg anyway. Usually the trees are not affected much by digging them out of the flat, even if they're pretty big and pretty crowded. They seem to transplant fine as long as you shade them. So that's how I do it. Again, you can even plant them in the ground, old school. Farmers used to do a lot of that, starting stuff in the ground and then lifting it out of the ground and moving it. So that's how I do it. As far as getting them to germinate, that has been a challenge for me and a lot of people. And I'm still working on that in different ways to maybe make that happen a little more reliably for us. Again, if the seeds are dried, you need to soak them up, get them all plumped up and ready to go, and then chill them long enough. And of course, that can be done outside if it's cold enough, or it can be done just in the fridge before you plant them. You can sprout them in the fridge before you plant them. One thing I don't do that a lot of people do is put them on a wet paper towel in the fridge, because paper doesn't really have the same resistance to mold and rot that, say, wood chips do. So I'll tend to use pine shavings or charcoal or something like that to store them, just as a damp not wet, just damp medium that has some aeration, and then just seal it in a Ziploc until it sprouts or till you think it's chilled enough, and then put it out. Also, don't let them get warm. This is something I just found out about, and that's probably been affecting me, is that they can go into a secondary dormancy if they get too warm. So they've gone through the chill, you plant them, put them in your greenhouse, it gets up to 80 degrees, and they're like, oh, time to go back to sleep, and they won't sprout till next winter. If that happens, you can often hold them over and they'll dry back out, and then you can they can sprout the next year, actually.
I've also had success, like we've talked about on the phone, just keeping seed wet, moist in the fridge, and they'll come up right away. But they could come up in the fridge. Excuse me. They can come up and start germinating in the fridge and rot. So I think there's a value to in drying it, and you have a shelf stable product then, if you dry it. Could we talk about, so you have some aspirations, big aspirations and cool goals, and with your altruistic efforts about getting farmland so you can do this on a bigger scale. And one of the ways that you're looking to do that is actually through your Patreon account and some things you put on auctions. And so there's been a question, and I'm sure there's also more interest. Where do you get pollen and seed and scion, and from you, and then also like other sources? I know that you're very collaborative. So
yeah, so I have pollen, seeds, and scions every year. The new stuff, the new varieties are always in limited quantity, and a viewer once was like, you should auction those off, and I was like, that's great, then people can set the price, because I have a hard time with that. So yeah, it's been crazy. Like, I've done really well with those auctions on FigBid. I've had scions go for up to like over $100 a piece, which is just crazy. And but it's great because it supports my work. And like you said, I'm not just about this project. I have a lot of other projects. One that would interest you guys is fruit tree training. I want to reform fruit tree training, which could be another talk. But yeah, so you can find them besides those new ones, which go on auction. You can find them on skillcult.com/store. And you really, just the best way to find out when stuff launches is to follow my blog on Skillcult, because I always announce there. I announce it on Instagram at Skillcult. I'm Skillcult everywhere, YouTube, etc. And at this point, anything that's a limited quantity gets offered to patrons first. And I kind of divide that into tiers this last year. So it's like tiered access kind of thing. And those guys usually snap up most of the intentional cross-pollinations. The pollen is more like I'll launch it, and then I just keep adding it to the website as I get it. So like each day I'll go get pollen, and I add the packets and just ship them as they're ordered, because shipping is super cheap on pollen. It's just like the cost of a stamp.
I think the your whole pollen effort is a real game changer, because people, like you were telling me one time, people can take your pollen and put it on apples that they actually have available and flowering right away, to gain access to new novel traits to recombine. I wanted to make mention, Nick Casco says, thank you, Steven, for your breeding work. I have fruited your Bite Me and Black Strawberry here in Washington. And I know on Nick's channel, he was actually waxing on excitedly about the Black Strawberry. And then also you sent me an amber wine this year, and my girlfriend and I were really impressed by the texture. It was a commercial level quality fruit. And it had this subtle, complex flavor, indescribable, that made us wishing that we had more. Josephine said, thank you, Steven, for your Sugarwood and Bite Me, both fruited this year in Washington, D.C. So we've
Looks like Chris is frozen there. Hopefully I'm not.
Hopefully it'll come right back. It usually does.
Testing. Hello?
You're there. Back.
Man, and the internet. So the genetic diversity of new varieties, writes somebody, is not the only issue. The real issue, most new apples that are being bred and trialed are being done and so in a totally artificial, chemically and supported environment. And they said they don't see any apples. I would disagree, that are coming down the pike in recent years that have incorporated known disease resistance. I would say definitely the industrial paradigm doesn't breed too much, but I think what you're offering is the perspective you're offering is that we can do this by our own hand. Do you want to speak to a little bit of that again?
Well, in terms of disease resistance, I mean, the stuff I know that's disease resistant is mostly modern. But modern is, I put that in quotes because I don't really keep up on the new stuff, what's coming out, what its characteristics are. I know very little about very new apples, so I wouldn't know about that. But I would think that they'd be working pretty hard on that because it saves so much money. And, I mean, it's not just a matter of not poisoning ourselves and the environment and the workers. It's literally just a bottom line, saves a ton of money to have disease resistant apples. So yeah, that's all I could say about that. What was the other part of that?
Just basic. I think you got it. And then this might be the same person. They say in another thing, when you are back crossing and when crosses are between modern cultivars, aren't you just continuing to limit genetic diversity in the next generation? Or is the bigger picture that at least you are A, creating new combinations, and B, make many other crosses that involve more unusual parents? And I think the previous talk answered that too, is like, it's not necessarily genetically bottlenecking because there's already so much diversity floating around. But do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I don't really keep track of lineages very much or alleged lineages. So I just use what's good and what works. I rarely do back crossing. I'm actually not that interested in back crossing. Where I'll do it is like, with savory apples or something, or certain red flesh apples, they may have a common parent somewhere back there, and I want to reinforce that trait. But in terms of like direct back crossing, very rarely do I go there. I'm actually more interested in just pumping in more diversity and more genetics. So yeah, I don't really do that actually very often. I don't worry about it either too much because I have so many different apples from so many different places, and I'm really interested in like the Eder stuff. Like you and I talked about how part of the reason that Eder was so successful and that we're using his stuff is he took chances on primitive genes and stuff that nobody else was using. And that's what, the direction we need to head in. And the more we get that in there, the better it's going to be. And at this point, a lot of the apples that we have are inbred and they work. It's not like a total death sentence. Like I said, a lot of plant breeding is just inbreeding. Like you're just inbreeding the stuff until it just keeps producing the same thing. And that can be problematic eventually. That's why we have hybrids and eventually kind of break out of that and go to inject some new genes in the mix. But it just, with the kind of diversity we have, it almost doesn't seem worth paying much attention to, except like you said, just don't use all modern stuff that's all bred from the same, few apples. Where there's a study done on that where they showed just how many apples came from just a few apples: Golden Delicious, Macintosh, Cox's Orange Pippin, etc. But I still use those. I'm not going to throw them out. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Is that the right saying?
And as Dr. Kevin Pease said, that there's crab genetics in the lineage of Honeycrisp, and that's
right.
Infused novel genetic linkages and phenotypes into the mix. And so
that's a place where that's a place where I might think about doing back crossing, would be to take something else that has those genes in it and back crossing those together to just reinforce some of those crab traits so they're less diluted, basically.
Dan Lefevre, I apologize, Dan, for my mispronunciation there, but he asks, he says, pardon my French. And I think what he's asking about, he says that are the fennel family of apples considered savory? And I think that the apples he's trying to say are Fenouil de Robours and Fenouil de Gris, which are both like really high quality russeted apples. But would you consider that savory?
No, not any that I've tasted. I have tasted that first one that I can't pronounce, and it's also in a lot of other apples. It's pretty strong in Carrie's Irish Pippin. It's pretty strong some years in Sweet 16. It's really not my favorite flavor, but I've never really detected that savory flavor. Now, I think the savory flavor is a small component in quite a few apples, but in a very subtle way where it's not like this kind of like that's the distinguishing characteristic of the apple. When you get one, you know because you can't explain it. And that's probably what you tasted in the amber wine is like that thing that you can't explain. And for years, I just called it the Wixon thing. But really, my girlfriend, way back, tasted Wixon and she nailed it right away. She was like, oh, it has umami. And then I just sort of forgot about that. And I was always trying to figure out what it was because I was trying to like equate it to a taste, like an actual flavor. And it's not. It's like a flavor in the same way that, you know, you can't say that just sour is a flavor of a food, right? It's just a component. And so, yeah.
For people that like those apples, another apple I recommend is called Gris Pontoise, Pontoise. It's a little russeted crab. I sent that to Steven, but I don't know. I think it's diploid, but it could be tetraploid like a lot of the russets are. One of the things that I think might be useful for people is you have on a number of your videos, and maybe you could talk about your YouTube channel just a little bit so people know how to reach you, one way to reach you and learn about what you're up to and, you know, the community that's collaborating. And growfruit.org, maybe you can mention that again. But yeah, just mention that for a moment to people. And then also, can you talk about your early apple work? Because you trialed through a lot of early apples and there are a lot of garbage ones out there, but there's some that have really shined, Carrie Pippin and others. So could you address those things?
Yeah, I mean, I just nerded out hardcore on apples before I started breeding. I was just obsessed and hours and hours and hours, like, you know, collecting. I have like a database of information on heirlooms and stuff. And what I found was, you know, I would search a lot for certain traits, like really late keeping apples and stuff like that. And I just found that most of them don't perform well here and they're not that good. It's very common for me to get a seedling and just say, this seedling's okay, but then realize that it just okay, but it's better than most of the heirloom stuff that I have. And a lot of that is just regional, right? So I've never been that impressed with Margil. I found one yesterday that was absolutely delicious. Just whatever. The year was just right for it. I don't know. And I was like, what's this great apple? I'm going to breed with this. But in other years, it's kind of ho-hum. There was another one this year, the same thing. So yeah, I just found that's why I say I feel like it's important because, you know, our climates are so different and these apples just are not going to do well everywhere. So you can probably increase your odds by breeding with stuff that does well in your area. Think about how many apples I'm going to reject or anyone's going to reject that probably would do well somewhere else, you know, but that's okay because we just need to do it. Just the answer is quantity, plant more seeds, thousands and thousands of seeds, and it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
What was the first part of that? All that?
Could you mention, maybe talk about your YouTube channel? Because I mean, you're pouring out content all the time there.
Yeah,
especially your live videos are great.
I think I've been doing that for 8 or 9 years. But the thing about my channel is that, like me, I'm a polymath, so I have all kinds of different stuff on there. I'm very inconsistent. If you're interested in self-reliance stuff, you know, it's great. Or the Apple stuff is a lot of my content now. Yeah, but it's there, and all the stuff on breeding is there in playlists. So if you go to the channel page and go to playlists, you'll find some playlists on apple breeding that you can watch, and all the different fruit reviews and fruit tasting and stuff like that. But I plan to continue doing that for sure.
You made a playlist that you sent to us, and I think that's going to be in the resources section. If you go back, folks, and you look at the recording, you're going to see that. Could you? There was a question about texture, and you addressed it a little bit. Like chestnut crab or centennial has that really epic. They're both related to each other, but they have that epic crunch and texture. And could you address some other textures that people come across, and maybe the relation between texture and red flesh? So some of the notes that you found. I think that's important for people to know.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are multiple textures. I'm always amazed that I just keep finding apples that have weird textures. One I call waxy. It's like for super fine grained apples, and it's hard to describe it. It's not really waxy. It just seems like the best descriptor. There's the rubbery ones. No coarse fleshed apple is ever like either one of those. Those are both fine grained characteristics, but there's other fine grained apples that will go mushy or mealy. So, as far as the red flesh association, I tend to think of red fleshed apples as coarser grained and tending to go like not so great in texture when they get ripe. But I've already got stuff that defies that. Robert Etter's Pink Parfait is absolutely delicious, super crisp in the winter, like deep into the winter. Outstanding, like kind of modern apple kind of melting texture, juicy and great. So it's possible, but the thing is that I haven't got the apple yet that has just the super outstanding crisp texture and really dense red flesh and really dense red flavor. So Pinker Lady is another example where it's like Pink Parfait. It tends to be more like a mottled pink, and the berry flavors, though they're there for sure, are mild. So that's one of the things, again, is like, getting rid of those texture problems and the low sugar and all that stuff, and carrying the flavor and the deep red flesh forward. And it sounds like I haven't had it, but again, like Ruby Glow sounds like it has probably achieved that.
Oh, it really has. Ruby Glow and or Lucy Glow and Lucy
Glow. Sorry, yeah, Lucy Glow
are amazing, amazing apples.
Excellent. So we're there already then. I mean, someone has done that. That's great. Good.
Yeah, I think it's using those dense fleshed apples, like Black Oxford, or that Chimney Park one I sent you, that are just totally dense and juicy, and combining that with red flesh. But we unfortunately have to wrap it up, which sucks, but it is what it is. So I really appreciate your time on behalf of NAFEX and our organization. Thank you for coming to speak today. And everybody, this wraps up the conference, unfortunately. But do remember that we have events every month, and so keep checking that out. And then also know that for any of these sessions, they're up, and they'll be up on the website. They'll be up in 1 to 2 days. A lot of the sessions have additional resources that you can go check out, nafex.org. Also, stay in touch and keep communicating on social media. We do have their Facebook page, but also check out @ExploreFruits on Instagram. And yeah, anyway, I thank you again, Steven. Really appreciate it. Chris is going to talk a little bit about sponsors here in a minute, but any last words you want to say, Steven?
No. Thanks for everyone. Thanks for all the support, especially patrons and just anyone who views, watches, shares, talks about. Thank you.
We've shared some of your videos on our NAFEX TV YouTube channel as well, and that's a channel that we're working to build up. So I think some of those playlists that you were talking about, we'll make sure that we share over there as well.
Thanks.
So Leslie's going to put up our sponsor list. I want to thank Steven for this keynote. It was wonderful. Took a lot of notes and actually put some information up on our social channels as you were talking. We want to thank our sponsors. This was made possible this year by our Trailblazer sponsor, One Green World. They sponsored us last year. They were our first sponsor last year and our only sponsor last year, but they came on again this year. And then we added Copenhagen Farms and Nursery and Edible Landscaping as our Discover sponsors. And then our Forager sponsors were Orchard People and Southern Cultured Nursery. Southern Cultured Nursery is run by one of our board members, Larry Stevenson. So we want to thank them for their generous sponsorship to make this conference possible. I want to give a huge thanks to Leslie for being the conference coordinator again this year. This would not have been possible without her. Chris Homanics joined us weekly for planning sessions. Again, just an amazing resource to make this possible. I want to thank all of you for your membership, and it's you guys that help make us continue. And we hope that we're going to continue for another 50 plus years. We've been around for over 50. We want to continue this. And you guys make that possible. We have lots of volunteer opportunities, even if you're brand new to the group. So when I came on a couple years ago, we had very few volunteers. We're trying to build that up and kind of bring that momentum, keep the momentum going. So you can help us out at numerous levels. It could be, you know, at the board level or an advisory panel level, at the interest group level. You could volunteer for a committee. And you can even help at your local level just by promoting NAFEX. And if you want some ideas on how to do that, please reach out to us at the email address admin@nafexmembers.org, and we'll be happy to talk with you about how you can help us even at your local level. And then there'll be a survey coming out tomorrow that we please ask you to take and give us feedback, because it's your feedback that helps guide us for next year's conference and for all other future conferences. So it's really, really important that you let us know how you enjoyed this conference. What were the sessions that really reached out to you? What topics do you want to see in the future? And then that will help guide us for next year. So finally, I want to thank you all again, and our panelists, speakers, our organizers, and for everyone for making this 2022 conference a success. It's just been a pleasure to listen to all the speakers, and I know I'm personally going to go back and listen to most of these again myself. They'll be available to you guys 24/7 beginning next week. And thank you all again. Thank you, Steven, and you guys have a fabulous rest of your weekend, and we will be in touch via email and our upcoming interest groups next year. So have a wonderful evening, guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much.